health threats to humans or to the environment due to pre-existing hydrogeological conditions. In Puuko, this is that the water table is very close to the surface of the ground. So any infrastructure going into the ground is likely to come in contact with that groundwater and be transported offshore. What this rule did was that any new construction or renovation of existing homes now had to have septic tanks. So in 2013, we were approached by the Puuko Community Association along with the Nature Conservancy and asked to address the question of whether sewage was making it into the nearshore waters at Puuko. And through multiple studies over many years, making measurements of different sewage indicators and conducting dye tracer tests, we can without a doubt tell you that yes, sewage is present in the nearshore waters. We've made measurements going down the mountain in the groundwater wells, down to the shoreline at Puuko, as well as at the adjacent resorts. And the dye tracer test that Steve will talk about later show that the wastewater from the homes is transported to the shoreline within hours to days. Following our initial study in 2014, community members approached us and asked us additional questions. One was, is sewage also being contributed to upslope developments or from adjacent resorts? They also wanted to know whether the on-site sewage disposal system at each home mattered, whether that affected the water quality in front of the homes. And they also wanted to know whether the sewage was making it offshore and impacting the reefs. So to do this, we've collected water from a variety of locations within the Puuko watershed, groundwater starting up Malka at the Waikoloa village, moving downslope to Manalani. We also collected shoreline waters from resorts to the north, Mauna Kea, Hapuna, Manalani, the Fairmont Orchid, and then also along the Puuko shoreline. So what did we find? So I'm going to present, the next couple of slides are going to be showing results from different types of sewage indicators. The first one is Enterococcus. This is a fecal indicator bacteria that's used by the Hawaii Department of Health, as well as the US EPA. And it's used to assess the safety of swimming and recreational waters that are potentially impacted by sewage pollution. And what we've found is that the Enterococcus concentrations at Puuko often exceed the Hawaii Department of Health's statistical threshold value. That's 130 mpm per 100 mil. At those concentrations and higher, if they are repeatedly measured in a certain period of time, the Hawaii Department of Health is required to take action. Usually this is through the closure of beaches until the concentrations come down below standard levels. The US EPA also has a marine recreational water standard. This is 35 mpn per 100 mil. And this is tied to epidemiological studies. So at those levels, they have found that your chance of contracting gastroenteritis is swimming in waters with these levels is about 3.6%. What we have found is that shoreline waters at Puuko often exceed those latter standards 2 to 3 orders of magnitude. We have also measured the same parameters in the groundwater wells up Malka as well as the shoreline waters at the adjacent resorts, and those concentrations are much lower and do not exceed the standards. So Enterococcus is also found naturally in the soils of Hawaii. So the Hawaii Department of Health has also adopted a secondary fecal indicator bacteria, Clostridium perfringens. This one is thought to be more indicative, a better indicator of sewage pollution. And what we found, as you can see on the map, is that the concentrations of Clostridium perfringens often exceeded the recommended marine recreational standard of 5 colony forming units per 100 mil. We also made these measurements up Malca in the groundwater wells, as well as along the shorelines at the resorts, and those concentrations were consistently low and did not exceed that recommended standard. The other thing I'd like to mention too is that the values measured at the Puuko shoreline fall within the range predicted for areas impacted by non-point sewage pollution sources, things like septic tanks and cesspools, which is within the range of 10 to 100. We also have used we've used molecular markers for human Bacteroides. This is the bacteria that's most abundant in the human gut. And so these markers can specifically target Bacteroides that have come from humans. And what we found was that we got positive hits for human Bacteroides only along the Puuko shoreline. It was not detected in the groundwaters up Malca or in the shoreline waters at the adjacent resorts. And there have also been epidemiological studies to tie this to risk of gastroenteritis, somewhere between about 2 to 3 copies per 100 mil. Your chance of contracting gastroenteritis is about 1 to 3%. The last sewage indicator that I'm going to talk about tonight is looking at stable isotopes in nitrate. Nitrate is a nutrient. It can come from many different kinds of sources. And by looking at the stable isotopes, we can distinguish where the nitrate comes from. Is it coming from fertilizers? Is it coming from soils? Is it coming from sewage? And what we found was that along the Puuko shoreline, the nitrate values were about +7, which is indicative of sewage pollution. And the values at the adjacent resorts were indicative of fertilizers, and then up Malca of soils. There was a recent statewide report that looked at values at shorelines across the state. And what they have done is they have moved that marker to about +4, which is indicative of areas that are sewage pollution influenced. And if you look here at all the shoreline stations in Puuko, they all fall within that range. We also wanted to see what % of the nitrate was derived from sewage. To do this, again, we looked at stable isotopes in the nitrate molecule, so that we could distinguish how much was coming from sewage rather than from other sources. And we put this into a mixing model. And what we found was that at 10 stations, so we went to 16 in Puuko, 10 of them, at least 40% of the nitrate was derived from sewage. And it was much smaller percent at other locations. You'll also see that it was a relatively high percentage in the alkaline ponds that we also sampled in Puuko as well. Now, these results agree well with other measurements that we have made. We've looked at nitrogen isotopes in the seaweed. We've also done a sewage pollution score and dye tracer studies, and they all agree with a high % contribution of sewage to these shoreline stations. So we wanted to put all of the different sewage indicator measurements that we make into context. So we created a sewage pollution score. This included information on nitrogen isotopes in seaweed, fecal indicator, bacteria, and nutrient concentrations. What we found was that most of the shoreline stations in Puuko had medium pollution scores, but there were 3 that fell into the high sewage pollution category. These stations correspond, they just happen to correspond to where we did dye tracer studies, illustrating that the sewage pollution score that we developed is detecting areas of high sewage pollution pretty accurately. I'd like now to turn the presentation over to Dr. Steve Colbert, and he'll talk more about some of our OSDS work.
So for our second question is, does the type of sewage disposal system matter? And how long does it take for sewage to go from sewage systems to the shoreline? And does the type of system make a difference in all of that? So for my work, I did these dye tracer studies at 10 homes here in the Puako community, where we'd go in and depending on what type of system, whether it was a cesspool, a septic tank, or an ATU, we would add dye into the system and then track how long it took to reach the shoreline and what concentration it was when it came out at the shoreline. The worst case scenario is you end up with a picture like this, where it gets to the shoreline very quickly and very not diluted. And so that's what you're seeing here is a fluorescein dye that we use, which is like what they put in your eye to do a glaucoma test. It's not bad for the environment. So we did this at these different systems, and what we found was that dye would reach the shoreline in some places in matters of hours. So basically, if you flush your toilet at high tide, it would be coming out at the shoreline at low tide, the following low tide, just a few hours later. At other homes, it took longer. It would take 3 days, it would take 10 days to reach the shoreline. And it didn't matter what type of system it was. The fastest time to the shoreline and the longest time to the shoreline were both with aerobic treatment units. That didn't affect how fast it was reaching the shoreline or how dilute it was. So like what's going on instead? One thing that we had noticed before is that the amount of groundwater coming out along the shoreline is different. There's more groundwater coming out in South Puako, less kind of in the middle section near the Catholic Church. What's going on is that there's a difference in geology in each of these places. Some places, there's lots of cracks in the lava. There's maybe lava tubes, something that's allowing fast transport of the water to the shoreline. Other places seem to have much more compact rock, harder rock, few cracks, just not really connected to the shoreline. And so we see these differences from place to place. There are some places that are more easily connected to the shoreline, other places a little bit less connected to the shoreline. It takes the sewage a little bit longer time to reach the shoreline. In front of those homes where we have those springs where we were able to identify this is connected to a home, this is with cesspool, this is connected to a home with an ATU, we measured the different parameters, nutrients, the fecal indicator bacteria, and that's what's being shown here for like the fecal indicator bacteria in Enterococcus. The concentration we measured at those springs, it didn't matter. It was pretty much the same, and it was all very high above the Department of Health standard. Similarly, the nutrient here is total dissolved nitrogen. We also measured that at these different units, and it was very high at all of those, greater than 100 micromoles per liter. To put that in context, the Department of Health has water quality standards for total dissolved nitrogen that's about 36, and all of our values are greater than 100. So lots more nitrogen coming into this system than we would want for any coastal system in the state. Why is this? It's because the water is taking some time to reach the shoreline and there's mixing going on. So homes with different septic systems, different sewage systems, that water is all getting mixed together. Throughout the community, you're ending up with this mixture of sewage that's coming out. And that's why we're not seeing any much of an impact, a difference from one system to another. So what we did was we then did some modeling based on the literature. We looked at, this is for Enterococcus, and we made, what if we got rid of all the cesspools and we converted them to ATUs or septic systems. And so we used literature values for how much Enterococcus would be coming out of those systems and made a prediction. And basically what we found is that at present, 81% of the stations along the shoreline exceeded the state water quality standard for Enterococcus. If we were to convert everything to ATUs, everything to septic systems, it'll come down some, but still we would predict that 70% of our stations would still have values that are above the Department of Health standards. The only way we could get it down to 0 below the Department of Health standards was to put in a sewer system, to get that sewage out of the system, to get the fecal indicator bacteria away from the shoreline and going someplace else, whether it's to the Manalani or to a new plant or whatever, but to get it, that water, that sewage water out of the near shore. Now, the next step is looking at what we found when we were looking at the reef itself. And so what we wanted to do is to compare, make water quality samples right above the corals off on the shelf. So we want to see, all right, we know everything we've been talking about so far has been at the shoreline, at the, where in the groundwater coming in. Now, is this having an impact on our reef as we go offshore? So we went out and we measured the values of the nitrogen isotopes in the nitrate, which is what's being shown here. And we did a similar analysis to see, well, how much of that nitrate is coming from sewage? And up to 50% of the sewage that was found at the reef was 50% of the nitrate was coming from sewage. Most places it was only 10 to 30%, but our maximum value was 50%. And there was one real outlier station that we think may be indicator of sewage coming from the Manalani Resort, from their sewage treatment plant. We also, at these right above the coral, right above the reef, we also calculated the same sewage pollution score that we had done at the shoreline. At the shoreline, we had values that were medium to high, and we found the same thing in Puako. At the reef here, still values for the most part in the medium range to the high range. Where we had the best water quality, it looked like was in North Puako, the north end of Puako, that seemed to have not as much as other spots. Now, while we were doing these surveys of water quality at the reef, we were also looking at the coral reef itself and doing surveys to see what the composition of the reef is. And that's what this is showing. There's a ratio of reef building corals, reef building organisms living on the seafloor. So like the coral that's there, the crustose coralline algae, and then there's also the things that are not reef building. So algae for the most part, macroalgae growing out there. And at most places along the reef, it was dominated by these fleshy, non-reef building things. And what that tells us is that our reef is having, it's not growing, it's shrinking. We're having an excess of these non-coral things growing out there, leading to a shrinking of our reef going on. And this is consistent with previous studies, like in the 2000s, early 2000s, over a decade from 2001 to 2011, there was a 10% coral loss here documented at Puako. And going back longer term, there's been, back from the 70s till now, there's been a loss of coral out there of at least 35 to 40%. So there's been a documented loss of coral out there, and what's growing out there right now is not conducive to getting that reef to grow more. Okay, so what about the other thing we looked at with the coral? It was coral diseases. What types of coral diseases are out there on the reef, and are there any relationships to the water that's in the area? So what's shown here is this, they're called growth anomalies that grow on the coral. They kind of look like tumors. If you see them on there, they're these like tumors, they're called growth anomalies. And we find them on the coral reef out here. And there was a pretty good association where the more silica there is, silica is a tracer of groundwater flow. It's high concentrations in our groundwater. There was more silica, there were more of these growth anomalies. And this has been observed in other places where there's been looking at Puaco specifically. There was a previous study done by a group from Cornell that made connections between the input of sewage and the presence of these growth anomalies. And then previous work here has also found the extent of algae growing on top of the coral and smothering the coral. To put it in a regional view, in West Hawaii, it was the number two place where you had the most algae overgrowth on coral was here in Puaco. So it's what you're seeing on the reef here is not indicative of what conditions are across West Hawaii. So to wrap things up, everything that we've presented to you today is in at least 4 different peer-reviewed publications that we've been able to put out from this work. It was important work that's been done here, and just getting this documented so that the community can use this information is really important. And so what I think we've been able to show is that sewage indicators are greatest here in Puaco. There was a statewide study that was done, island-wide study, 12 different beaches around Hawaii. And some of these indicators that we showed you today, highest by far here in Puaco compared to any place else on the island. And ranking in the top 6 across the state for most sewage impacted. What I found with the dye tracer studies was this fast flow of a matter of hours to days for that dye to reach the shoreline, and that it's really the geology that's impacting it, and just really showing that it's a community issue. It's not just one, it's happening across the community. The sewage detected on the reef is having an impact. We are detecting sewage on the reef, and it's likely that sewage is impacting the coral that's growing out there. So we really think it's paramount to have a sewage line put in to get that sewage off of the reef and to improve the water quality for swimming, for personal use, and for the coral reef. So again, thank you to everyone. Thank you for being here and for your support over all these years. And thank you to our students, undergraduates, and grad students that made all this great science possible, and the funding agencies as well. Thank you.
I assume you'll take questions?
Yes, please.
Questions?
Tracy, you have to come up because you have to speak in the mic.
Hi, have you made this presentation? By the way, it was phenomenal. Thank you so very much, both of you. A lot of information. None of it is good for Puaco, but have you made this presentation to our county government?
We've asked to meet with the director of, what's it called? Environmental Waste Management. We wanted to share our results from Puaco as well as some other places where we've been working. We did provide the PDFs for the publications, but we've yet to sit down and make recommendations. We've looked at the priority list for the state. We definitely think Puaco, it's a #1 to do the conversion. We also think Hilo should be close second before Kailua Kona. But we're hoping that they will come and sit and talk to us. I know that they've hired consultants to look at all the information, look at how the state has ranked which areas will go first, what options are available to them. And I hope they consider meeting with us so we can share direct information for the places where we've worked.
So I swim a lot out there and I've had infections from swimming out there, but I have noticed in the last couple of years, we have this non-coral growth, these algae. Have you been out there lately? Like
No,
this year
I
is worse than ever.
was just hearing stories about it, and
Yeah.
I was out there snorkeling a few months ago, and I noticed small patches of algae that I had never seen before, and surprised me. But it sounds like it's really exceptional right now.
It is. If
It-
you want to be horrified by what you just said. And so,
I was trying to think through like how you could actually, it seems like something that needs to be documented. And I was trying to think through what the way to document that would be.
like pictures, you mean?
Yeah, but like, I think the Department of Aquatic Resources has specific places where they normally do surveys, and they may have like long-term, hey, normally it's like this, but now it's different. So like tying in where those pictures are taken to specific DAR location
And I
is
was
my
gonna say
first
the,
thought.
the other locations too would be maybe some places where we did surveys, but also the Nature Conservancy.
Yeah.
So like if we, look at those stations, maybe where relative to where you swim, and we took recent pictures and compared it to when pictures were taken in the past, we could document the difference.
That's a great idea.
I have a question. Have you done surveys further north, like Kailapa and Quality States, in that area?
No, we have not. I've collected a few water quality samples up there, but nothing extensive. And I was just reading something about, but no, I haven't. What's your comment about it?
Well, we need to compare. It's affecting them also up there.
Yeah.
Because I'm worried about snorkeling, people out there diving. We have people down here diving. When is it going to be prohibited for us to get in the water? With the numbers that you stated is really high. So what year? When will it be prohibited?
Do you know if Department of Health has a station in that area where they sample? I mean, I personally don't know. I'd have to look at their records to see if they regularly go to a location there and look at like the Enterococcus.
So it's still safe to get out there in the water?
You know, the safety question is an interesting one because like I still go to the beach. I know what conditions are like, and I'm still going to go swimming. It's not going to keep me from going out snorkeling, but I make sure to take care, and I shower off as soon as I get out of the water. And and if I have a gouge, then I'm probably not going to go swimming.
Water's brown, I'm not gonna go.
Yeah.
But yeah, we both go swimming. It doesn't stop us knowing what we know.
But the Kailapa issue is an interesting one. I'd be interested in talking with you more about it. Yeah, exactly. And one of our challenges has been shoreline access there and just not tied in with the community to have those access. So that could be interesting.
Yeah, we'd be happy to meet and see what we could do.
Just as a follow-up on that, I'm wondering I think the water is deeper up there. Do you think so? It seems like it is to me. Does that help with dilution?
It's the solution.
It definitely has a negative impact on Puako. Even the picture of green water that I showed up there earlier, part of the reason the sewage didn't get out of that area and it turned so green is because it's kind of like a little tide pool, and you have these nice little shallow areas as you go out that restricts the circulation, and you don't get the dilution. You don't get that. It's great for kids playing in the water, but it's not great for getting that nasty stuff out of there.
What about the big rains we've been having, these giant storms? How does that affect the reef and pollution?
There was in 2015, there was the big coral bleaching event that really hammered your reef out here. And after that, Department of Aquatic Resources did a study. The state knows, Department of Aquatic Resources knows that they can't stop coral bleaching. It's a climate crisis problem. As things warm up, the coral is going to bleach. But there's still management things that the Department of Aquatic Resources can do to improve the health of the reef. And there's local actions. And the number one thing they identified was getting sediments off of the reef. because of the negative impact of sediments on the coral. And the number two thing was removing land-based sources of nutrients, which is fertilizer, sewage, those kinds of things. Those were the number one and two things they recommended to get off of the reef in order to, so that the coral when a coral bleaches, it doesn't die, it's just sick. And if its conditions are good, the coral can come back to life. But if there's sediment, if there's nutrients, so basically you're taking a reef that's already being impacted by the excess nutrients, and now you're adding a second stressor. One of those things I pointed out is that the North Puaco Reef is the healthiest part of the reef from what we saw, the healthiest stretch here. And then seeing all this sediment coming in, we were standing over here on the side looking in the water, and it's like, oh my gosh, it is muddy. That's not a good combination. So
But the kinds of things that could be done to reduce that would be at the watershed level. So going up Malco, what could you do to reduce the amount of sediments coming down if these rain events are becoming more, occurring more often? So it could be working with like the watershed partnerships. They put in things like, if you go down the Kauai High Road, they have debris dams. They're like these giant burritos with rocks and wires, and they put them perpendicular to the slope. So when the water comes down, it traps it. Or different kinds of revegetation stuff. Those things could be done to try to trap the sediment before it gets down to the ocean.
I don't know how much this would fall outside of your wheelhouse. I imagine you guys know some, given the work that you do, but beyond the knowledge that the people that lived here in Puaco in the 50s and the 60s and maybe around 1970 would have of the condition of the reef, coral cover, fish biomass, things like that, how good the fishing was, how good the snorkeling and diving was in, say, 1970. Do you know, just generally, how much baseline studies do we have, and how far back do they go to? So, you know, what's been the shifting baseline of the health of our reef? How much do we know going back, say, arbitrarily to 1970?
I haven't looked at it closely. There is, in terms of the historical information about Puaco, there's the Department of Aquatic Resources study that they did in the early 80s, and then they repeated it in the early 2000s. And they were able to document, they looked at everything, fish, coral cover, and other things. And then there's another study that was done by the Nature Conservancy, and it came out in 2012. I can get you the information on it. And what they did was they did some of that historical work and going back at least to the 70s, and then comparing it to the more recent conditions that they had observed. And again, yes, focused on Puaco there. So those are the two studies that I'm familiar with. I think the TNC one probably has more of that documentation in it. Yeah.
Hi. I have a question about, you know, your levels of sewage and where the health to basically allow swimming is. And, you know, I'm from California, and I'm just sort of wondering, or we live in California a lot of the time, and we have a sewage leak and they close the beach for a while. And they using the same markers and pretty much the same data that you've just presented here in terms of determining if it's safe?
Well, the US EPA ones are national. So that's the 35 one for Enterococcus. The Bacteroides one, there isn't a standard for it, but the US EPA has a method. And a lot of people have been going to that because that can specifically tell you that the bacteria that you're measuring in the water came from the human gut. So the methods are pretty consistent. A lot of the newer methods have been coming out of some of the labs in California and then being applied here in Hawaii. But the US EPA standard is federal. And then the Hawaii Department of Health standards have to get approved by the US EPA, and oftentimes do correspond with those in other states as well. Clostridium perfringens is only specific to Hawaii.
You want to
Thanks.
talk about the timing of sampling of Enterococcus?
So for our study, we really wanted to see if we could detect sewage in the water. So we timed our sampling with the lowest tides in the morning. We do that because that's when the most groundwater is coming out. We think the groundwater is carrying the sewage. We do it in the morning because as the sun rises, it starts to deactivate some of the bacteria. So we were trying to target the times where we had the best chance to detect it. But Hawaii Department of Health samples whenever they can. It's not targeted like we did. There's only 2 people for the whole entire island, and they collect when they can squeeze it in, and they have to get it back to the lab within 6 hours to run it. So they can't continuously go back to the same spot repeatedly every day. And they only do that when they detect a problem. And then that's when they're required to do more monitoring.
I just had another question about the bleaching. I'm not sure, is that from the heat? And is there any documentation about what the water temperature is happening here in Hawaii that I'm sure you guys know about? Just curious.
Yeah. Just to finish up about the Enterococcus and the sampling, I believe in California, they're required to sample in the mornings, and they only do their sampling in the mornings, whereas here it's happening later in the day. So they've kind of taken that into account, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, because some of those researchers are from California. Probably influenced when they do that stuff.
Yeah. And then the coral bleaching is when the waters exceed all corals locally have a thermal tolerance. And if the temperature exceeds that thermal tolerance by 1 degree Celsius over a 2-week period, the coral tends to bleach. And when it bleaches, what it does, the coral is it has this symbiotic algae that lives inside it. It gets rid of that. And so it's kind of losing its main food source. That symbiotic algae is about 35% of its food consumption. So it loses that, and it's then just kind of relying on what's there. It's temperature dependent. So for example, 2015, when West Hawaii got hit, there was, it was a warm year, but then there was this second blob of hot water that came across the west side of Hawaii Island. We are expecting to have more coral bleaching events in the future. You may have heard on the news that there is a global coral bleaching happening going through this summer. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here in Hawaii as we get into September. September is kind of the peak time of our water temperatures.
I have a question that I've heard other community members ask, so I thought I'd ask it and get your recorded answer. So people have said, well, if we can't take care of the whole problem, why even bother removing the waste from the reef?
I mean, you want to explain?
So that's the question is, should we as a community even bother putting in this sewage treatment plant, knowing that we can't control the runoff, even though the county says they're working on it? Is it worth it to us for the health of the water and to save the reef?
The more stressors you have, the harder it is for the reefs to be resilient. So hopefully the county or like the watershed partnerships can work with you and help to control some of the runoff and sediment coming down with these rain events. But the sewage pollution is carrying all sorts of different things. It's pathogens from your body. It's the chemicals that go down all the drains of your house, right? And that's all going out into the water. And you don't want to personally be exposed to that because that can make you sick, but it's also making the reef sick. So I do think it's important. Yeah, maybe the corals are being quite challenged, but I think it's in our best interest to do as much as we can to try to give them the best chance, and especially to make the water safer for us all to be able to use.
I have a follow-up question to that I've also heard.
Let me just add in a little bit more there. The sediment issue, I think, is a local problem. It's a relatively small spot it's affecting this little area here, whereas the sewage pollution problem is affecting from Hapuna all the way down to Paniao.
Great, thank you. And then the other, pardon me, the other follow-up question, well, I'll let you ask a question.
You have very compelling research, but I'm just curious where that research has gone. And when you talked about the county government not taking any action, yeah, I'm curious about the county government as well as the state government, because it's compelling research, but if it doesn't get to our legislature or the county council, you know, what can happen?
Yeah, we've been frustrated over the years at the slow pace that the county has made changes. The good thing is in the statewide report, Puaco is in their priority 1. And so put in a priority place for upgrading and for getting rid of cesspools in the area. So, you know, I think they are hearing it at the state level. Getting the action happening at the county level has been more challenging.
Following up on that last comment.
Yeah.
You mentioned trying to get in front of the county to make your presentation. What can we do as individuals? Any suggestions as to what we can do as individuals and communities to apply pressure to the county to make that happen?
For example, we just have an area here.
Yeah, and I think I assumed that this topic came up at when he was here.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so I think he's heard that. I don't know what the status of the South Kohala sewage management plan, or is it just the island? There was money that was supposed to come to Puaco to make changes, and it got taken and moved to something else. And I don't know what the status of that is, or if they had community input on that. You know, it would be putting it in. I don't know. I feel frustrated with the county.
Yeah, I mean, I would just keep asking them, because what I heard is that the money got moved to the general plan, and that within the general plan, they were going to look at how to deal with sewage in Puaco, but I haven't heard anything since then. I would just keep pressuring them, especially if the mayor keeps coming. Maybe ask to have a meeting with Ramsey Masur. We'd be happy to join whenever those meetings occur if we can help share the information. We're going to keep asking to meet with them because we think we have valuable information that can inform the decisions of the county.
And that's why we asked to talk here too, because we know that you're all still interested, and we're still here to support you.
You mentioned in the presentation about the potential contribution from the Mauna Lani sewage.
Oh, yeah.
I'd be interested to hear a little bit about that, because that's one of our options, is to tap into Mauna Lani. But if they're contributing to this mess, then that may not be a good idea.
So I've been to the Mauna Lani sewage treatment plant. They do, was it just primary treatment, just settling?
And secondary, the settling is
Secondary. So they settle out all the solids, and then the water they inject into a well. Where that water goes, I don't know exactly, but it goes down slope, and it's just upslope from Paniao, if you look at the maps. And the value that we detected on the reef, it was just happen chance, but that value was very high and indicative of sewage, likely from a sewage treatment plant. We never saw values that high along the shoreline. I can't say for sure that it came from the Mauna Lani. The data suggests potentially. My concern with hooking up to the Mauna Lani is that it's an injection well, and they do not disinfect the water, which was very concerned. I was surprised that was shared with me. They don't do nutrient removal. And so unless that plant gets upgraded to a higher level, I wouldn't want Puaco to be connected to it, because I think you can do much better.
I have a follow-up question to the question I asked earlier, again, from someone else, was do you have documentation of people entering Hawaii hospitals sick from swimming in the ocean?
We've never collected that type of data. It's all hearsay. The same thing in Hilo, it's all hearsay. So we don't have any health information tying water quality to health infections in the nearshore waters.
Okay.
You want to mention a little bit about the difficulty of doing that kind of work?
Yeah, it is quite difficult. You do need special kinds of permits to collect information on people. And you have to get hospitals or different medical centers or doctors and patients all to agree to share that type of information. It's definitely out of our wheelhouse. We're not epidemiologists. I definitely think that information would be really interesting to collect and could be very helpful in making stronger cases. But we need to find the individuals with that specialty who could do those kinds of studies.
And just kind of similar to Mauna Lani, what's the effect of Hapuna? I don't know what they're on at the state park, but
I'm pretty sure Hapuna is on a septic system, that there's a septic tank and a drainage field that then flows out to the ocean right there. That's how I understood it, and just kind of in walking around there and looking at the ground and seeing what they had, that's what it looked like. And I know, yeah, I know Beach 6, yeah, Wailea Bay is the same way. We'd been offered, we'd worked with the state about potentially doing a dye tracer test at Wailea Bay to see how long it took for the dye for sewage to reach the shoreline, but we didn't push too much to do that. It would be, I'm a little nervous about turning Wailea Bay green like that picture, and I don't want. We don't want to scare people. We don't want to scare people. Yeah. Well, maybe.
So I have a little bit of information about the Mauna Lani plant. They do injection wells, and that plant is required to be upgraded to further treatment, but I can't tell you the timeline. No, it's relatively soon. So my vision is that by the time we can get a collection line and they will get new customers, that will give them more income to help that. They have to upgrade at some point, and then that will push all that.
Who's requiring you
I think like DOH, EPA regs.
to? Do they know what kind of upgrade? I'm just curious.
I don't.
I kind of remember it was from whatever, there was like two types, and type 1 and type 2, and they had to move to type 2 and they're only on type 1. That's like really bad info.
I believe
Yeah.
it has to move to tertiary treatment.
With the injection wells and what happened at Lahaina, the Lahaina sewage treatment plant problems, and the went all the way to the Supreme Court. I think a lot of sewage treatment plants around Hawaii that do injection wells are going to have to upgrade as a result of that Supreme Court case.
Or not use injection wells.
Or reuse
Yeah.
the water.
Any other questions? Any last comments?
I have one more question,
Okay.
which is not anything we've really talked about. Do you know of any economic data, or where we could find it, for the value of just the Puako Reef, or even South Kohala, or even West Hawaii? Because the reason I'm looking for that is I just think that usually gets people's attention. And I do believe we are quite a driver for tourism. And there's a lot of dive boats, there's manta ray tours, there's kayak tours.
No, I'm not familiar with the economic data. I would go and look at the, I believe it was the UH economic group that did the statewide economic survey. And maybe in that report, they have it broken down more, or talking to the authors, they might have some better values.
I don't know of any particular studies besides that one, which was quite a while ago, I think early 2000s. But Kirsten Olson, she is a faculty at UH Manoa. She's in the Natural Resource Environmental Management department. She does that type of research. She's done it for other places, but I don't think they've done it for Hawaii Island.
Well, thank you, Tracy and Steve. That was fabulous. And I was just looking around the room. And there's several of us who were here 10 years ago begging you to do these studies. So it was really nice of you to come and present your findings. We're really close with Ramsey. So
We're happy to come and join the
great. Wonderful. And speaking of getting a sewer system, so not October, June 6th, Arenco is coming, who has a collection system that they've put together a preliminary proposal for us. So please come back on June 6th for that presentation. So, and thank you guys for making the long drive from Hilo. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much.
I was just going to say, we're here for the long run to help you get to the point where wherever you go, we're here to see you to the end and then to document all the great improvements. So.